My name is Shirley Liu. I'm with the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence. I'm super excited to welcome you to our webinar today on trauma-informed care for Asian and Pacific Islander survivors. As you can see, I'm joined by three amazing presenters from Texas Muslim Women's Foundation. And we're excited to be in discussion with you today. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. This webinar is the second webinar in our series on trauma-informed care for Asian and Pacific Islander survivors. I'm seeing some familiar names in the attendees list, so some of you may have been with us last week. If you missed that webinar, it is available on our website, and this webinar will be recorded and available later as well if you'd like to share with anybody. We also have another webinar coming up on September 17th, so I can share more information about that in the chat box. Closed captioning or live captioning is available for this webinar. If you go to the bottom of your screen, there should be a little icon in the bottom bar for closed captioning, and that'll let you bring up the captions and select how you'd like to view them. Throughout this webinar, or throughout this panel, please feel free to use the chat box or the Q&A box to share any questions or share any insights or resources or respond to each other in the box there. Just be mindful that it is a public chat, so be careful with sharing names or details. We're going to leave a lot of room at the end for questions and answers. So just a couple of introductions. Like I said, I am with the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence. A lot of you may be familiar with us already. We are a national resource center, a technical assistance and training provider, and we work towards ending gender-based violence in Asian and Pacific Islander communities in all the various forms that gender-based violence takes place. Our role is to develop resources, trainings, technical assistance, and advocacy, including policy advocacy, to support the work of those who engage Asian and Pacific Islander communities in the U.S. to end violence, as well as support Asian and Pacific Islander survivors and their families on their paths toward healing and well-being. We work across the board with different groups to advocate for and to train on what does culturally specific service mean to our communities. So those we work with include community-based organizations and direct service agencies like TMWF, courts and judges, lawyers, interpreters, translators, law enforcement, and policymakers. I think for me, one of the best parts of my job is learning from advocates, working directly in the field and working directly in their communities, and in recognizing that they are the experts in their work. And that one of the most valuable things that we can do as a national resource center is give agencies the space to share their work and share practices with each other to build peer learning, if you will. So feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat box. Just a quick agenda. Our presenters, as you see from TMWF, will be presenting most of the time. I will not be speaking much more than this. We do assume that you have some understanding of trauma and the way it looks in our communities and how trauma manifests. So there's not going to be too much time spent on that. The presenters are going to be talking about a project that they did at TMWF to become a trauma-informed agency. We all want to do trauma-informed work. The question is, how do we do it and what does it involve? What are all the pieces that go towards making our work for survivors trauma-informed? How do we check to make sure what we're doing is meaningful, and how do we go back and evaluate our services and our programs to make sure that we are providing trauma-informed care in a way that is meaningful for the communities that we're serving. At the end, there will be a long question and answer session. This is a panel discussion, and so we did reserve about half the time for questions and answers. So make sure you're putting your questions in the discussion box. Any topics you want to raise, any issues that you want the presenters to address. One thing to keep in mind is that I think the chat box will default you to addressing all panelists only. So just make sure that if you do want your message to be going to everybody, to select where it says all panelists and attendees. And as you can see on this slide, there's a little screenshot of what that looks like. So in the to field, you want to select the little drop down caret and make sure it's going to whoever you want it to go to. So we have been working with the Texas Muslim Foundation, Women's Foundation, for many years. Mona will be describing them a little bit better than I can here, but the Texas Muslim Women's Foundation empowers, promotes, and supports all women and their families in a mission to create stronger communities. Since 2005, the Texas Muslim Women's Foundation has been an ambassador of the peaceful, caring Muslim community. And one of the recent projects that we supported them in was their 4-year project to intentionally incorporate a trauma-informed lens into all aspects of what they do, including staff training and development, board training and development, programming, shelter, the physical environment of their agency, et cetera, et cetera. And through this project, they developed all sorts of tools and metrics that they will be sharing today. They also wrote this amazing report with this graphic of the lotus that they'll be talking a little bit more about today. This report is available online. I will share the link to download this report in the chat box. So I'm gonna pass it over now to Mona to get us started on the presentation. So Mona is the Interim Executive Director at TMWF. She's been at TMWF since 2007 in various roles. Most recently, she was the Chief Philanthropy and Operating Officer and was responsible for TMWF's operational management and long-term strategic goals.
Thank you, Shirley. Thank you, and hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us in this wonderful presentation and webinar. And most of it is going to be a conversation, and we learn from each other. I think that's what Shirley was pointing out too, that we will leave a lot of time for discussion. Before I begin, I really want to thank API for being our partner at so many levels. This is just one level of partnership, and creating this manual was labor of love for these women and our agency. So I really want to thank and acknowledge the partnership that we have with API. And every time we have anything that we need to learn, we look up to you guys. So thank you so much. My teammates that we have today, I would introduce them. We have Dr. Dishana Jayasundara. She is an associate professor at in the Department of Social Work and Education at Cal State University in Fresno. She has 20+ years of experience in the gender-based violence field. She has served as a direct practitioner, advocate, evaluator, grant writer, and a researcher. In the DV field, her expertise is definitely trauma-informed cultural practices. She is and has been an advisor to TMWF for many, many years. With me, I have Durdana Ahmed. She has been in this field for 8+ years. She used to work in a shelter in California, then moved to Texas and joined TMWF in 2011. And she was a case manager. She became lead case manager. She also was sort of an outreach arm of TMWF. And most of her years and most of her time spent at TMWF has been very valuable to us. And obviously creating this manual was part of her work. And she has been a very effective case manager for TMWF. She's moved back to California, so watch out, ladies, if you want to get hold of her. But she has been very effective. I remember people used to give us a call and say that they would only want to speak to her. So her passion, her compassion, her empathy was very, very obvious in the work she was doing at TMWF. So thank you both for being here. Next slide, please. So what does it mean to be a trauma-informed care agency, or what does trauma-informed care means? And like Shirley said, I think most of you would be already familiar with what trauma is. And trauma care is being mindful of somebody who has gone through a lifetime of traumas, and their understanding that what kind of impact that has happened, and how to address that, and how to be mindful of all the traumas that anyone has gone through. Keeping that in mind, I would share a very, very personal story, and a short one. I have been on the other side of receiving what trauma-informed care means and how it can change a person's life. My mother had stroke a few years back, and the doctors had told her that she was paralyzed neck down, and for 2 weeks there was absolutely no movement in her body. The hospital we were in, that kind of added to her anxiety, because there were male nurses picking and helping her, or the food that she was ordering was not being understood. So we had to move her into a hospital, which I knew was a trauma-informed hospital, where the staff was trained to be trauma-informed. The minute we entered that space, the first thing they asked was, how about you tell us your story and your culture? And the family was able to share, and they understood the culture. So my mother never faced a male nurse. She knew, or the nurses knew, what kind of food she will have. So keeping that in mind, her recovery was so fast, and that hospital actually keeps a record of how fast that recovery is when the services are trauma informed. And I saw that, and I realized how it can impact somebody's life and change the trajectory of that. So that to me is a very personal story on how trauma-informed care can change people's life. We'll go over, okay, if you can move to the next slide. The way we'll go over a history of TMWF, because you have to understand where and how TMWF was formed, and based on that, why trauma-informed care became an important conversation, and then the project itself, the plan, implementation, and the lessons learned, and what are we doing now from sustainability point of view. So next slide. The history of TMWF is also as unique as our own services that we provide. TMWF was formed in 2005, and it was right after 9/11, where a group of Muslim women in Dallas-Fort Worth area were going through the reflection of what has happened, how our faith has been hijacked, or what is the narrative being told, and while we are in the background. So that was on everybody's mind when these group of women started working together. They came from different backgrounds, they came from different fields. So, and I'm talking about good 10 to 15 women. And when they started to identify what were the issues that Muslim community was facing at that time. So definitely domestic violence was one issue that was identified. Youth mentorship, because in school children were being bullied before being Muslims and harassed. So what did youth mentorship look like? So that also became one of the priorities. And then the third thing, which was very near and dear to the founders, was how has this faith affected their lives, and what was being told on the media was not a true reflection on them and their lives. So interfaith and showing what the faith is became the third very important component of mission of TMWF. So in 2005 onwards, when these missions, these ladies started to speak in the community and talk to people, more domestic violence conversations started coming up, that women cannot leave their homes. They go back to the abuser because understanding the culture, understanding the language, even simple things as understanding their food choices was very hard in mainstream shelters. So they preferred going back to the abuser rather than going and changing their life and going to the shelter. That started to come up in a commonality of what the TMWF mission was. So founders decided we will tackle the domestic violence and social services as our primary goal. And then after that, we would have youth, and we would also have other programs in parallel to social services. So when these women started to work on the referral and social service, soon enough they realized that a volunteer is not going to have it. So by 2008 they were ready to hire, and they hired the first part-time social service employee, where we were working on the referral. After that, it grew into fundraising for the shelter. And in 2010, we were able to hire 3 full-time staff members. Fast forward 2012, we were able to establish our first shelter and 24/7 hotline. By 2014, the way the program and the need was growing in the community, 2014, we acquired a number of transitional housing, realizing that the shelter is not only is not going to be the only thing with these clients. They needed longer time to stay. So transitional housing was acquired. And then 2019, based on so many community needs and a lot of cases that we had to turn away every month, we were able to secure and start a second shelter. So right now, last year, we started a second shelter. And this year, our growth has mushroomed. Right now, we have 2 shelters. We have 27 transitional apartments with 43 employees between part-time and full-time. So from 2005, this is our 15 year, from founding members' vision, where everyone was a volunteer, to 2020, in 15 years, we have mushroomed and grown. And that is based on the need, what the community saw. If you can forward that. With the establishment of first shelter, we immediately realized how our services are going to be unique. And at this point, I'm going to ask Durdana to go over what did it mean, and how did we come to this conclusion that yes, we were culturally specific. However, what was trauma-informed care for us, and how we ended up going into that route. So I hand it over to Durdana.
So hi everyone, thank you for making time for us today. And thank you very much, Mona, for that beautiful introduction. I don't know if all of that was true, but still, thank you. And we were culturally specific, and from the get-go. So how did we realize that we needed to be trauma-informed as well? That's what I'm going to be speaking to, and I'm going to start with an example. And so before there was the shelter, there were manuals, and there were policies, and many, many policies, and many, many manuals. And all of these were related to the shelter, how we were going to take care of the clients, what the staff were going to be doing, how we were going to manage safety protocols, everything. I mean, anything you can name, we had a policy for it, and it was all written down, it was all documented. We had shelves and shelves of manuals. And then we received our first survivor. So our first survivor was brought to us by the police. She came with her 3 children, and she came to us directly from the hospital. Her abuser had beaten her up, and then he had broken her ankle by stomping on it, and then he left her lying on the floor, and she was locked into the room for almost 2 days without food, without water, without any kind of medical attention. She had basically fainted by the time he broke her ankle. She told me, I heard the crack of the bone breaking and I fainted. So once, after almost 2 days, this abuser left the house for something, and one of her children, her eldest child, was able to call 911. And so the police and ambulance came, and she was transferred to the hospital. When she came to us, she was still on crutches. She could only manage to walk a couple of steps at a time. She came in the evening, so I met with her the next day, and she was still in shock. She was still in pain. She was traumatized completely. Her children were in shock. They were bewildered. They didn't know what was going on. They couldn't understand it. So at that point, obviously, I mean, we realized that at that point, we couldn't do an in-depth interview with her. We couldn't ask her for much information because she wasn't in any kind of condition to supply us with information. So we just did I was her case manager. I just did a completely basic interview with her just to get a rough idea of what she might need. And the shelter manager and I decided that we would give her a few days for her to gather herself, to be able to settle into the shelter, to make her children comfortable, make herself comfortable. So, so that was where we were at the beginning. And since she was at the shelter, it was one of our policies was that she would automatically meet with the attorney, she would automatically get counseling. So all of these things started gradually, and she started receiving these services. And our attorney met with her. She determined that our survivor was a good candidate for a VAWA application. She also wanted to get a divorce. So all these things were slowly being put into motion. The children needed a lot of counseling. Our survivor needed a lot of counseling. So we started working on those aspects with her. And what we realized is, especially her eldest child was, she was 15 at that time, and she was completely in shock, and she wouldn't talk. She wouldn't talk to anyone. So we realized that we needed a lot of time to gain the trust of the children and also our survivor because of the immense trauma that she had just gone through and the children had gone through because they saw everything that happened. So the other thing was that we also saw that her physical and emotional state were such that she wouldn't be able to start working anytime soon. So we realized that she would probably need more time than one of our policies, which was 3 months maximum. So these were all things that we were slowly coming to understand while we were working with our survivor and while we were providing counseling services and legal services, and I was doing her case management. And we were meeting her. I, at that point, was trying to build trust and build a rapport with her because everything she'd been through had been horrific and it was just overwhelming for her. So at that point, the counselor encouraged her to start writing a journal, start keeping a journal. And it was very hard for her at first because she, like she told me, she said that writing in the journal is bringing up a lot of memories, and it's bringing up a lot of emotions. And I write 2 lines, then I sit and cry for 10 minutes. So it was a difficult process for her to go through, but she kept at it. We kept encouraging her, we kept supporting her, and she started, actually in the end, she started enjoying it, because she said that this feels like catharsis to me. And this is talking about all these things, talking about these memories and writing them down. So many things are coming up that I had not even realized were there. And at one point, right before she left our shelter, she handed me her journal and she said, "I want you to read it." And that was a huge moment for me, because she was sharing these very personal stories that weren't meant to be shared. I mean, the journal was for her, but she was willing to share that, and she wanted to share that with me. So that was a moment that was, I think that was one of the huge gifts that she gave me, that she wanted me to read her journal and see what had happened to her. And one of the memories that I read about was that she had been repeatedly raped as a child. And she had told her mother had refused to believe her. And she ended up repressing all of these memories. And she told me that as an adult, I couldn't figure out why there was a huge chunk of my childhood which seemed to be completely blank. And I didn't know what had happened during that time period. But once she started writing, then all of these memories started coming back. And she also said to me that being at the shelter, and at that time, like I said, we had already determined that 3 months wouldn't be enough for her, because her broken ankle took almost 3 months to heal. And so we kept extending her time period. Each month, at the end of each month, we would review everything that was going on with her and the children, and we would give her an extra month. She actually ended up staying with us for 9 months instead of the 3 that was our policy. So that so she said that the extra time that she had, it gave her enough time to feel safe. She felt that she was while she was at the shelter, she wasn't having to worry about rent or getting a job or doing any of those things initially. That gave her time to focus on herself for the first time in her life, to feel safe for the first time in her life. And she felt like she was in a cocoon. She was enveloped in a safe place, in a safe environment, where she could, where she felt free to share her stories, and she knew she wouldn't be judged. So that was one of the key elements that we learned from our first survivor at the shelter. So when you work with survivors, it's not a one-way street. The advocate telling the survivor what to do or teaching them anything. It's a two-way street. We all learn from each other. And this was one of the biggest lessons we learned, that we have to work at the survivor space. And we have to allow them the space, we have to allow them the time, we have to allow them the time to breathe, time to form bonds, to be able to trust other people. And so I'm going to cut this short and quickly leave you with a quote from our manual, which you'll all be getting. The advocate will guide and support, but the healing has to come from within the survivor. It cannot be hurried, or it cannot be prescribed. So this is the main lesson we learn from working with this survivor, that we have to let the survivor set the pace of her healing, of her well-being. And this was one of the key lessons we learned, that yes, we was culturally specific. We were mindful of that, but we also had to be mindful of the survivors' well-being, and taking an approach that was holistic, taking an approach that was meaningful to the survivor, and not prescribing or imposing our own version of healing, or our own version of how fast they should be doing things, how fast they should be getting a job, how fast they should be getting into their own apartment. So that was the key. And now I'm going to hand it over to Dishana, and she's going to take you through the program.
Shirley, if you can go to the next one. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, and good afternoon. So I will be talking about the process we took to become trauma-informed. So as Dodana said, you know, TMWF was a culturally sensitive agency, and it was beginning to understand that we need other lenses also. And during this time when we were thinking, and we were hearing about trauma-informed care perspective, and it was actually at API-GBV conference that they announced that there was a FIFSA grant for agencies to become trauma-informed. And so we applied. It was a 4-year grant, 800,000 for 4-year grant. And we were lucky. We were one of the ones who got selected. And so as we really from the beginning, because, you know, because of some of the things that Dodana was talking about, agency really wanted to go through deliberately the process and not just do it for the grant's sake. And we wanted to really create a culture. And so initially the identified process was that we had phase 1, phase 2. In the phase 1, we were going to do a self-assessment, and then we identify what we need to do and make changes, and then we successfully implement them, and then we carry out. And then my role in that process was as a kind of a facilitator and the evaluator. So I want, you know, from the beginning, we knew we wanted to capture what we were going through so that we can create a training manual. And so we were trying to, my role was going after all the staff and just kind of talking to them and survivors and talking to them and kind of looking at the process aspects as well as, you know, is it effective after everything we did? Is it effective? Shelley, can you go to the next one? So in the first phase, so we were, first of all, I just want to acknowledge from the very beginning, we worked very closely with API-GBV, and it wouldn't have been a success if it wasn't for their support team actually. And every step they came in and assisted us. And so at the beginning, we wanted, before we even started, we wanted to know, we have staff from I think about 23 different countries, and people with 14 different languages, speaking about 14 different languages, and our survivors come from about 60 something countries. And so this was a very multicultural, diverse community, and people were in different stages. Like Dodana was talking about, some staff were beginning to identify we need trauma-informed care, and then counselors were already gone through trauma-informed care trainings. But then there were others who other staff. There was staff who hasn't even heard of it. And so initially we did some assessment to even identify what is their knowledge of trauma, what is their understanding of well-being, what are some of the aspects that they see in the community kind of. So, you know, once we did that, got that basic understanding, with that knowledge, actually API-GBV came and did a 2-day intensive workshop. The initial workshop was done by API-GBV, giving us a training on what trauma-informed care is, and it oriented us to kind of the concepts and what to look for in trauma-informed care. So with that, the first training, we knew now we needed to go through a self-assessment, not just asking about what, understanding what staff knew about trauma. We needed to go through extensively looking at where is our agency in terms of trauma-informed care. So one of the first things we did was we looked at existing self-assessment, scales that were out there. Well, I took all these scales and I went to the staff, I went to some of the survivors and administrators, and they all said that there are certain items we like, but we don't feel like one of those individually will fit what we represent. So if you can go to the next one. Shirley, if you can go to the next one. Yes, thank you. So we ended up taking some of the concepts from all of them and then creating our own. So the areas that the staff and the administrators and survivors kind of identified was that, physical and sensory environment was very important, and that we needed to do a self-assessment of that. This was all understanding after our training. And then we realized the programming environment, to see if we are responsive for survivors, how are we delivering it, and the collecting individual and collective needs was very important, as well as the cultural environment, which is what is the culture within the agency? Are we conducive to healing, not just for our survivors, but for the staff who are also survivors sometimes? And what is it? Is the culture toxic or culture nurturing? We wanted to look at that. And then of course the relational environment, which is what we understood is the outside. How do we interface with the outside, the stakeholders? Are we, in our interactions, are we empowering? Are we informative of trauma-informed kind of concepts? And so this assessment was very closely created with staff input and API-GBV input and some of the key survivor input. So if you can go to the next phase. So as this self-assessment continued, within that self-assessment, we actually came up with, we identified as we were doing it, even as we did the training, we realized the first training that API-GBV did about informing us about trauma-informed care, we realized that our agency, like the story that Dodana was talking about, we may not call it trauma-informed care, but we were doing a lot of things that were congruent with trauma-informed care. And we also realized that there was no way that if our agency wasn't culturally sensitive, given our population, diversity within diversity, so much of diversity, if we were not responsive to that, there was no way that our agency would be considered a trauma-informed care. If somebody comes to us with face aspect, or if somebody comes to us and say that, I wear a kurta, I need, that's my only clothing and I need that. And then hijab, if we do not provide that, we are re-traumatizing, right? And so we realized that some of those concepts that are embedded in trauma-informed care, we were already doing. So we needed to identify strengths also. And then we also realized, as we were identifying action items to change, we also realized that some things we were already doing. For example, we had, when we had the first training, we realized that our agency at that time was filled with pictures of people going through domestic violence and, like very terrifying pictures. And we didn't even think that, the first thing when somebody comes in, what they see is this whole room filled with all these domestic violence, right? But as we were doing that, we moved officers, and in that process, even before we decided to implement, because of that first training, we actually put in cultural and healing, like flowers, lotus, and ethnic, painting that represented the backgrounds of the staff and the survivors, right? And then of course we identified different areas. For all of those 4 areas, we identified different things that we wanted to do. And then of course we wanted to identify, we wanted to make sure we identify barriers. Of course there's going to be barrier, and of course, and I can tell you that this was not an easy process. This was like we moved forward, we thought like everything went fine, we're doing so well. And then for example, we had one of our major administrators leave, and that actually left everybody kind of stranded, and there were a lot of emotions about things, and we were almost at a point, is this agency going to go down? And so actually at that point, you know, it was a barrier that we didn't anticipate, but within the, we have come so far along, I mean so far along that we were able to use the trauma-informed concepts itself to come out of it. For example, a lot of processing, a lot of we had 90-day strategic training. We had to do programmatic audit as a result. We needed to have a lot of discussions, and kind of shared leadership came up as part of it. And so we identified these action items, but then it wasn't an easy thing. And honestly, we thought, like, you know, initially when we decided, we thought 1 year to identify and implement everything. But honestly, it took us 3 years to actually implement, because some areas were implemented, some were not, and some, as we were going through, we were identifying other areas that needed to be implemented. So it was a process that we had to go through. Shelley, if you can go to the... So as we, you know, in the end, we were, I mean, the thing that we learned was, we initially, when we were started, we were a little bit naive. We thought, okay, we do it and we implement, we are done, yay, we are a trauma-informed agency. And we soon realized it's a process. Success of the agency really would depend on if we can create a culture of a trauma-informed, right? We had to figure out, how do we create that? And we went through a lot of different actions. So first of all, we went through numerous trauma-informed training, almost all of that that was available. We had staff go through quite a bit of those trainings. And then, but after about 6 months or 7 months of training, staff came to us and said, Tishana, it's actually great that we know about trauma-informed care now. We understand that we have to be mindful and conscious about it. But what do we do if a client comes, a survivor comes to us and then is threatening and is threatening to sue us, and she's being right there? How do we address something like that? How do we address difficult situations? So then we had to go back to the board, and we realized, okay, some of the basic trauma-informed trainings is not enough. We need to dig deeper. And so we ended up having mindfulness training, how to deal with difficult survivors, how do we deal, you know, how do you create boundaries, ethics trainings, and motivational interviewing training. So we had to go much deeper into, and the trainings had to continue, and we needed to have a supervision process that was created with shared leadership, and that needed to help the staff. Along with that, we also realized halfway through this, we didn't at first concentrate on self-care. Halfway through, we realized self-care was absolutely essential for staff. And we realized that some of the staff has gone through the same scenarios that survivors have gone through, and that self-care, without self-care, we couldn't go through. But we also ran into barrier there. Staff were all ready to identify direct staff, but then the administrators did not want to initially adopt that. And administrators said, you know, we love the staff to do it, we love our survivors to do it, but we carry the weight of the agency. We have to be on call 24/7. We don't have time for self-care. Unfortunately, as Mona can speak, if administrators do not take self-care, it impacts them also. So eventually it became where the administrators also started adopting self-care approaches. Can you go to the next one? So So what we ended up doing was, so my role in all of that, so we became, I mean, as I said, it was not an easy process. Lot of, like, you know, lot of different, you know, we as Dodana said, we had these very strict policies about this is how long you can say. We had to look at those things, and we changed a lot of those policies, and we had to change quite a lot of our manuals and how we address things also. But then we also ran into another thing, because the grantors, local grantors, were saying we need numbers, but then trauma informed care says we need to provide more time, longer time. And that also meant that we needed to go to grantors. So immediately, and Mona will talk about some of the continued efforts we are doing, but immediately when we had to go to our federal grantor who gave us, and kind of with their support and API-GBV support, we actually had to go to local grantors and tell them, look, our clientele, and if we are trauma informed, which means that our survivors need longer time, and we needed to give examples, and like Jordana's story, we needed to go to grantors and tell those kinds of stories to get them to be understand where we come from. And so the evaluation process also needed to look at all of these things. And so the evaluation process was, you know, the process that we went through, and we also created, as Shirley mentioned, several scales. One is that self-assessment tip scale, a TCAT scale, sorry, trauma-informed assessment tool, and that is available in the training manual that you will have. So when we did the assessment, we wanted to make sure we wanted to make sure that we went through the process, we did all these things. Did we really make a change? So first thing was, we did tip scale afterwards also. After we went through also, we did the tip scale. And then we wanted to know, are the survivors feeling that we changed? And luckily at that point, Chris Sullivan and Lisa Goodman came up with a tip scale, trauma-informed practice scale. And so that was congruent, and it was culturally sensitive. And so we were able to utilize that, and it showed that our survivors were happy. But then it wasn't enough that survivors were happy with how we provide services. We needed also to find out, was it that you know, what is it ultimately? We asked our survivors, what is it that you ultimately want out of it? And the survivors actually said, we want well-being. And honestly, you know, we created the well-being scale alone in direct support with the survivors and staff. And honestly, as an academic, my idea of well-being was very different from what the survivors and the staff were coming up with. So, but it was something, a labor of love, and it was a culturally sensitive and very practical scales that we came up with. Shirley, is there any way that we could show those? I could show them, if you can stop for a second.
Of course, I'm going to stop sharing, and then if you want to share from your screen.
So this, I mean, this is in the manual. I just wanted to go over it quickly. So this was like the first thing that we asked this survivors, the well-being kind of trauma questions. And this is actually our the TCAT scale. So these were some of the items, and you can actually look at it in the manual, but I just wanted to kind of show you. And then this is how we collected our data to identify how to change, and identifying barriers and all of that. And so there's 4 different areas, as I said, and I just also wanted to show the well-being scale here. So this was the implementation plan. We created something for implementation, making sure that we stay accountable. And this is the well-being scale. As you can see, there were the language was wasn't something that there was wording that I thought would be easier if I worded it in different way, but then they thought it was different. They wanted it different. Survivors wanted it different. And, you know, what they identified as well-being was a lot of tangible, financial, kind of self-sufficient areas. And so that was, you know, so this well-being scale is also there. We have pre-post different ones. Shirley, if you can go back.
Yes. I hope.
So if you go to the next one. So these were some of the things that, as I said, we created. We also created an internal resource manual with all of, so the staff actually had all of, staff had, you know, resources, so that whenever new staff come, they had videos and trainings and everything that they needed to acquaint themselves about trauma-informed care. So currently, I would say our TMWF has where even staff leaves, even administrators leave, you know, whoever comes in, that culture, I would say, is created, that it continues. And now I would actually pass it on to Jordana to talk about the lessons learned.
So there were a lot of lessons that we learned along the way. Some we learned very easily, some were basically stomped on us, so we had to learn them. And it's a lot of things Dishana has already gone through, that while we were in the process of implementation, there were many things, because we had a lot of focus groups with staff members and with survivors while we were going through our implementation stage, and we were self-assessing. So there were a lot of lessons that we had learned, but I'm going to just mention a few things that really stood out to me. So one was the importance of understanding the essence of the survivor in a cultural context. And number two was dealing with survivors without a hierarchical system in place. So we found out very quickly that survivors respond much better and are much more open to, much more open with their feelings and with their well-being and with anything they need if the advocate addresses them on equal terms. So it's a term of mutual, it's a environment of mutual respect, and it's an environment of helping each other out. So I'm going to give you a short example, quick one, because I think we are going over our time. But I had another survivor that she came into the shelter. She was, again, she was sexually abused and she was beaten up and she was locked out of the house. She had to run to neighbors. Until one finally let her into her house. This was at night. So she's running around the neighborhood without any shoes, and people were scared. But one of them finally let her in, and she was able to call 911, and she was brought to us eventually. So she was very highly educated. She was fluent in 5 languages. She had held a very good job and worked and lived independently. She was an amazing lady when you met her. But because of what had happened, she was completely overwhelmed by shame. So this was, when she came to us, she wouldn't even look me in the eye when she talked, because she was so ashamed. She was just crushed by what had happened, and she was just crushed by what had been done to her, and she wasn't able to share initially. So so we basically just chatted. I said, okay, we'll go into all the details later. We'll sit and talk. And we started to, she came from a country where, which is a neighbor of my country, and we shared very similar languages. So we were able to understand each other. I mean, she knew fluent English, but sometimes she would speak in her own language. And we very quickly discovered a shared interest in music, in the movies we'd watched growing up. We found out a shared interest in spirituality, even though we were from different religions. But these common interests really were conducive to a very good bonding between us. And she told me once that when I talk to you, I don't feel like I have to explain. I don't feel like I have to tell you anything. You understand me. You can instinctively pick up things that like a friend would. So there were commonalities between us, and those were the things that we were able to bond over. And if we had treated her, I think, as, okay, I'm the provider, you are a person who needs help, then we wouldn't have been able to bond, and she wouldn't have been able to share her story and her pain and her needs as openly as she was able to because of that bond. So number one was understanding of the essence of the survivor in a cultural context. Number two was dealing with the survivor without a hierarchical system in place. Third point I really want to emphasize, which is what Dishana also mentioned, is self-care for the staff and having a very cohesive and nurturing team in your workplace. So that works absolute wonders, because if the staff are able to trust each other, if the staff know that someone else in the team has my back, if there's someone that they can go and talk to if they have a problem, then that makes a world of difference. Because if the advocate feels supported, if the service provider feels supported, they are able to provide much better services to their survivors. So that is absolutely crucial. So we, once Dishana mentioned that one of our key administrators had left. So after that, we went through a lot of debriefings. We went through, did team building exercises. We started regular yoga sessions. We started having group lunches, like we would, every pot lunch, everyone would come in, bring something, and we would all share. And that would give us time to de-stress, to relax, to get to know each other a lot more. And that really gave cohesion to the team. And we found that was really beneficial for the well-being of the staff, and also for the well-being of the survivors who came in. Because when the survivor came in, they could see that the staff members were laughing and talking to each other. So it created a much happier and much more open environment. So that was another point. Another thing is that we had a meditation room in our shelter, and that was a very important part of the shelter. So providing a space for the survivors to go in, to just be alone, to pray, or to meditate, or whatever they want to do, just have some alone time, was a very important thing for our survivors, we found, because it gave them a sense of, because they were living in communal living, obviously, but so it gave them maybe 10 minutes, 15 minutes of alone time that they could just relax and be with themselves and with their thoughts and compose themselves. And we were also able to provide that for our staff in the office. So we have a care corner in the office which staff can go to. They can listen to music, they can exercise, they can pray, they can just lay down for 5 minutes, do whatever they need. So the care room and meditation room at the shelter, care room at the office, those are very essential to the well-being of the staff and the survivors. One fifth point I want to mention is that came out of the focus groups, which I think Dishana already went over that. in some detail, but one thing she didn't mention, that the survivors, we found they wanted a community. They felt that as divorced women, as women who had left their homes, they had been ostracized, or they were outcasts within the larger society, within their larger community. So they wanted to form a community of their own. They wanted to be able to meet each other, because a lot of them had formed friendships during their stay at the shelter. They wanted to be able to continue with that. They wanted a place they could meet and just hang out, socialize, for their children and themselves as well. And other things that came out, they needed housing, low-cost housing. So that's where the transitional housing came up. They needed reliable childcare for their children while they went out to work. So we had to come up with something to fix that. They needed some help with transportation. So TMWF bought a van and to transport clients and the survivors in. So these were all things that came out of the focus group that we held with survivors, and asked them specifically, what do you need for you to feel good? The last thing I really want to say just before I sign out is, never assume anything. Just because you find out that a survivor comes from a certain background, they come from a certain religion, they come from a certain cultural aspect, you don't assume that they subscribe to it. You don't assume that they identify with it. You don't assume that they are part of it. We have a lot of Muslims who are not observant. So you really have to modify. You don't assume anything. You have to take your cues from your survivor. You have to base your interactions on the cues they are giving you. So that is the most important point that I can make. And this is something that I learned the hard way. I'm meeting a Muslim, I start saying things and they're not responding. So there's a blank wall there. So you learn along the way. And this is one of the most important lessons that I learned, is you never ever assume anything. The survivor should set the tone of their cultural context. The advocate needs to listen, listen, listen. And the advocate should follow the lead of the survivor, and that is trauma-informed for me. That is trauma-informed, that makes sense to the survivor. And now I'm going to hand it over to Mona. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dishana. Thank you, Durdana. Shirley, would you move a couple of slides over? I'm just going to wrap it up by one more about talking about the sustainability. So this, please know that this was a 4-year project, and there was a before and a project, and then there's an after. How does after, or sustainability for trauma-informed after the project look like? During those years, we were able to educate the staff, the board members, and even in some part community as well. But as the TMWF, as the organization grow, more people join in. So how do you sustain that trauma-informed culture? And I think we all know that culture will eat strategy at any given time, for lunch or for breakfast, depending what you want to call it. So how do you change the culture of an organization where the new people coming in would join that ethos of trauma-informed care, which is so important to sustainability? And I think the entire team, we all understood that challenge. And one by one, we started to address it. One of the things that I think Dishana has already touched base was shared leadership. That for us as an agency is extremely important. Apart from shared leadership, you also have to understand that there may be some of the staff members who have gone through their own trauma. So how does that look like? So from my side, I'm not a practitioner, I'm not a direct service person. From the administrative point of view, what does it look like for me when I look at an agency such as TMWF? For me, the important thing is I have to take care of the staff. I have to take care of the people who are providing direct services. If I'm not able to do it, then in turn, it will not happen with the client either. If I have to make sure that if a staff needs to rest, they need to rest. If they need to unwind, like Dordana said, we have a space where they can listen to their own music. We actually have an exercise machine, so we encourage yoga and biking as well. So we created that space, a safe space where, you know, after continuous therapy or dealing with difficult clients, they can go and take some time off. Flex time is something that, you know, we have to work on, and we have worked. And also there was one question about how does self-care look like in the times of pandemic. Our office right now is remote. So even right now, once a month, we do entire organization webinar, and we bring in topics that the staff has asked. So for me, for us as an agency, it is not what some people in the leadership think, and then it trickles down to the staff. It's the other way around. And this concept I've learned by, it's a new concept. It's called design thinking. It is a special innovation where you can definitely, you know, share the innovation, and each staff member is part of the organization. Their decisions, their ideas are respected and brought to the table and even go forward. So from staffing, from sustainability, that is very important, where you have the staff buy into the organization. Apart from that, board training. Every year we do board training on trauma informed. New members joining in, they have to, it is a must for each board member and sign off to understand what trauma informed care means. So board training has been there every year. Not only that, we even go out and go to the community. We have a radio program that tackles trauma informed in different languages. We go to the faith-based institutes, and we ask them to deliver a lot of sermons on what does domestic violence, family violence looks in within our community. So outreach, definitely very strategic outreach. Training within the staff as well as the volunteers, anyone who comes in through our doors, every member, even a volunteer, gets training on trauma informed. We have a video that they have to see and understand what trauma informed is. So that is part of the sustainability. Shirley, one slide over. And in the end, I do want to wrap up and by saying that, you know, what is TMWF's key commitment to trauma informed? I would want you to read the first paragraph and also the second. I won't read it for you, and understand that this is where TMWF stands and this is where we will grow. I'll just give a minute, and then we are open for question and answer. I saw some of the questions in, and I was able to answer. The rest, we'll able to tackle it together. Okay. Shirley, we're wrapped up. So the next one is Q&A, comments, anything we're open. I see a couple of questions that I was able to address. A couple of them are here. I think I was able to address how is self-care working while staff is working remotely. So what I do is maybe once a month, what I had asked different restaurants where, you know, our staff members can go and grab a treat for themselves, a dinner, because we were doing, shelter staff is doing 12-hour shift. So I worked with some restaurants to support our staff. So every time when people come in and say, hey, I have something for your clients, and I say, perfect, great, I love it, but can you put some share for our staff members also? So the restaurant support was also for my staff. Once a month, a webinar where we just chat and have a nice conversation. Then the other thing is me checking in with every staff member. That part is so important. That, you know, during COVID, some of our staff members right now, their relatives passed away in New York. How did that feel? So making sure your staff is connected to each other, like Durdana said, we have to have each other's back. We have to be each other's support system. So this is what our self-care during the time of COVID looks like. How do you reconcile the need for overwhelming need for the shelter space without survivors' need for time? We want to be able to help as many women as possible, but we also want to respect the survivor's own process of healing. Durdana, Dishana, do you want to answer this?
So because now we also have the option of transitional housing. So once the shelter is a crisis shelter. So now, because when we first started, we didn't have the transitional housing. Now we have it. Now we can move our survivor and their family to the transitional housing, and they can have more time there. So that works out really well now.
I think we have to work very closely with the grantors. When our numbers go low, we actually explain. And as I said, we actually meet with the grantors. And I think that I cannot emphasize how important it is to keep a conversation going and telling that the numbers itself don't tell the story. And our manual also helps because we give the manual also. So, you know, to tell our story, I think that has helped to get, like, you know, when because if they have to stay longer, that means that the numbers are going to get, you know, low. So that's what we have done basically, to kind of advocating for ourselves to do that. Because if you want to stay true to trauma-informed care, you need to meet where the survivors are.
Absolutely. One other question is, can those 3 points be repeated again? This is from Bella. I think all these points, I believe, are in the manual. So once you receive the manual, I think more details will follow in those. We have extreme details of everything that we have shared here with you. So
Shirley, are you sending it out? Oh, it's also in API-GBV website as well as Texas Muslim Women's Foundation website.
Yes.
I'll make sure it's sent out to everybody, the links, so that they can download it. And we are recording this webinar, and we're going to make it available on our website afterwards. So if there's something you missed.
And then one more question by Christine, and I hope I'm pronouncing the name right. How can we motivate survivors to do tasks that can help them become self-sufficient, even if they are in the revenge mindset? So, Dishana, Durdana, do you want to take this?
Dishana, I think it would be good.
I think that once again, I think that one of the things that we have to understand is that I think it's a change, not so much the survivor as our mindset, because we have this notion that our survivors need to be in a certain place. And that is one of the things that we had to go through. And even as a practitioner, I had to go through, is that understanding that, you know, this is where they are, listening to, kind of going into understanding what are the factors that are serving as barriers. Sometimes it's really, it could be depression. Sometimes it could be fear. Sometimes it could be just simply lack of motivation. A lot of times we also realize, like, for example, parenting, right? We had a survivor Child Protective Services is telling her to do parenting, and she was lapsing, and she had 7 children she was almost going to lose. But then in conversation we found out that the information Child Protective Services was giving was not enough for an immigrant survivor. She didn't know how to find it. She didn't know how to, and even though she spoke English, it wasn't enough to do a training, a parenting training. And so understanding, I think if we take time sometimes, I think that we might find that there are always layers and layers of factors that underneath. And for us personally at TMWF, what ended up happening was that changing some of our mindset and expectations and an idea of those aspects also. And we have some trainings that I think we will be able to send also, that motivational interviewing trainings that that were helpful actually in motivating, that our counselors were using too.
So there's a question that came in, but it has the same tone, that how long do we work with the survivors due to language barrier and trauma? They spend a lot of time doing cause management, and also, the clients stay with the agency for quite some time. So I think that, and there was a similar question that, how long do we work? How long?
We work with them as long as it takes. We had clients that, I had a client who came to me initially, and she told me about her situation. She wasn't willing to leave her abuser at that time. And she kept in touch with me for 3 years. And she came back at the end of that 3 years, and she said, now I'm ready to leave him. Now I need the attorney because I want a divorce. So she kept in touch. So it takes them 3 years, 5 years, as long as it takes.
And I think as cultural agencies, we collectively, when we write grants, our stories need to go out. Our stories of why it needs to be individual, why it takes longer. And I think that also helps us get grants if we tell the stories, right? Like Jordana, so very articulated provider, like telling those kinds of stories. I've noticed that those kinds of things helps them to understand and advocating, right? And that's one of the things that TMWF we had to do, is advocate at the grantor level, because they are the funders and the end that defines, right? So if they can limit how long we work with a survivor. So telling that those stories is important. It takes however long it takes.
And we also have to remember that the process of healing isn't linear.
Exactly.
It goes back and forth. So at one day they might be very happy and things might be going well. Then something happens and it triggers them and they're set back. So we need to understand that at the trauma-informed level, that these things won't go smoothly. They'll go back and forth. They'll be gone for a year, then they'll suddenly come up again, and they'll need services again. So we have to keep all those things in mind.
So another question is that how do you evaluate the outcomes then?
We have the scale, Dishana.
So we actually, so that well-being scale I showed you. So our, the outcome, the way we looked at is, so our agency provide a myriad of services at this point, right? Counseling, case management, housing, transportation, child support, empowerment support, financial education. I mean, it's lot of services, right?
Parenting classes.
Parenting classes. End of the day, we are doing all of those things. If what they are going through, domestic violence is also trauma, right? What is the opposite? It is a well-being, right? So we evaluate by giving the scale. The case managers are the entry point and sometimes the exit point also, right? So the case managers have to give the scale at the beginning and at the kind of end or halfway through. So that is how we assess to see, is their well-being improving?
Okay, so two other questions. I personally would like tools to help me, to help the management to see how important it is to support staff in self-care, in enhancing their skill, and have some fun and leave politics out of it. I think that question can be directly from me because I come from that perspective. And it's literally, how do you explain that to me? And I'll tell you, the language that I understood again was, if I cannot take care of the staff, they will not be able to take care of the clients. And who's going to run the organization where there are no clients and no happy staff? It's as simple as that. And understanding, and the leadership has to have a reflective attitude. You have to reflect, and you cannot be, you know, I think in every day in and day out, we are so used to making decisions. And I think, and I give you one single word, tell them to attend this course, and it is called design thinking. It made 9 days, it made me stop making decisions, and they would force me to stay with the problem. Stay with the problem. Do not think of a solution, because first few solutions may not be even right. So design thinking really changed my decision making. And I think anyone who can do this must attend and realize how it can impact your decision making. So definitely keep that in mind.
I also think that, you know, sometimes administrators don't listen to staff, unfortunately, but they do listen to experts. And some things, you know, I help a lot of agencies, and sometimes, you know, like API-GBV coming in actually helps if you want, like having a training from, for example, they are our resource TA provider, and they were very helpful in actually navigating with different areas. So I think utilize them. That helps too.
Sorry, I have a background noise, so I'm going to mute. We have a couple of more questions. Shirley, would you want to read it? Let me fix the background noise I have.
Yeah, of course. There's a couple of questions that came in earlier in the chat box. There's a question around, this one came actually before the webinar, practices for building relationships with children of families and respecting cultural differences.
So, so we obviously had a lot of children coming into our shelter with their moms. And I would say we didn't have any special practices or treated them differently. Children are children. So obviously we provided them counseling services. We had a counselor who did play therapy with them. And I think personally, I feel that if the mother is feeling good, you build a relationship with the mother, then the children get comfortable with you. So children take a lot of their cues from their parents. And if the mother is feeling comfortable where she is, if the mother is feeling comfortable with the people around her, then the children will be okay.
I think as a cultural agency, we take for granted, I think that TMWF takes for granted sometimes the cultural aspects of how they interact with children. Because I remember that one of the cases that came to Texas Muslim Women Foundation was unfortunately Child Protective Services. There was a child that went into child protective system, and it went into a different religion, family with different religion, and that family was telling that child to denounce being a Muslim and practice this other faith, and that was really traumatizing the child. And I think that we forget that, and TMWF of course has to do trainings and work as an advocate and be a trainer. I think that being mindful, children are their parents also, right? And I think that understanding, sitting down with them, understanding, talking to them, that is also very helpful, I think. And I think training other organizations, if you're a cultural agency, or talking to cultural agencies, if you're a mainstream agency, I think becomes very important.
Thank you. And I think that's a segue to talk about this next point that was raised around survivors experiencing racial and religious slurs and Islamophobia, and how that can be a barrier to reaching out for help.
I can tell you from my perspective that especially after 2016, what we saw, there was a major drop on our numbers, major drop, because the clients were now threatened by additional stuff of ICE and everything. So that happened. And as an agency, how we tackled this was, again, outreach, one-on-one outreach. I think in our work is extremely important. You can have a group of people, but one-on-one really helps educate people and bring the community. This work is a community work. It's not just one person's work. So you have to have important partners with it. So we partnered with mosques. We partnered with our local coalition and dealt with these issues of, what does Islamophobia or any additional, there are so many additional traumas that a lot of people are going through. Beginning of this year, we have staff and we had to face what Black Lives Matter within the staff. So how do we process it? Leave a lot of time for processing within the agency, within the staff. And I keep saying the reflective leadership. You have to reflect. You have to have the staff talk, because one fine day I'm looking at some staff members, they started screaming and they started yelling at clients, or, even with the staff members. So how do we process as leaders? How do we process that is very important. So you need to create safe spaces for them, whether it is in the form of support groups or your staff led some support groups, or out of the office, but that's the way to go about taking care of these issues.
And we have 2 more minutes, which isn't enough to tackle all the questions that we have, but I do want to end on one important question, which is any insight around working with survivors who are Muslim and also LGBTQ?
It's what I heard, I think a couple of years back, that Muslim LGBTQ is, the numbers are not the numbers are not true. The numbers are so high because they face discrimination not only with their family, extended family, their friends, their faith communities, even workplace. So the amount of violence that they face is way higher. And I know there was a question, how are we handling this? We are bringing experts in the field to talk to our staff. To me, if staff is equipped to handle the clients, then I think that's the way to go about it. So bring in experts who are either they have experienced it or they understand what it means to be in that community and face. We have some nationwide groups of Muslim LGBTQ. Maybe that's one way to connect them and help them understand how their own identity works. So our first way to handle was definitely bring in experts and train the staff.
I think that 101 trainings were also completed, right? And after the kind of expert trainings, if they identify some staff are struggling with concepts, I think that one of the most respectful ways to go about is having 101 conversations and understanding what is the reluctance or where are they coming from. And I think that approach was very effective in creating a supportive environment in Texas Muslim Women's Foundation. So that 101 is also necessary with some staff, I would say.
Yes, exactly, because we have to keep in mind that the staff are members of the larger community. So when they join, they may have their own biases. So to bring everyone up to a certain level, you have to have one-on-one trainings, and you have to keep doing it. It can't be one-time training. It has to be repeated trainings and open conversations about this subject, because in the Muslim community it's very much taboo.
I would be happy to connect you with some national level resources. I've sent you my email. If you can just, email me, I'd be happy to connect you with those resources.
So I just want to say we are we are past time. Thank you so much, all three of you, Durdana, Mona, and Dishna, for
Thank
being
you very
on the
much.
panel today. I know I learned so much, and I think the attendees did too. If there are any residual questions, I think if you want to go ahead and send them to me, you can see my contact on the screen, and Mona has also left hers in the chat box. Feel free to email us and we can help connect you to resources or other agencies or anything like that. I do want to add just one plug for our webinar in 2 weeks, same time. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Is it just us?
No, I think,
Okay, it's still recording, right? Okay.
yeah, I'm just going to end that now. And I think folks are still here. We have a couple folks still